In the 1950s and 60s, the US and the USSR jockeyed for dominance in the space and atomic races. It was a game of one-upmanship on a grand scale. Who could build the deadliest atomic weapon? Who could launch the first satellite? And who could get to the moon? But the Americans and Soviets were not the only ones competing for atomic might and glory in space. Britain too was anxious to build up her arsenal and explore the mysteries of outer space. Years were spent developing a homegrown system for launching atomic weapons and satellites. But days before Britain's own Prospero satellite lifted into the heavens on board her own Black Arrow rocket, the launch program was cancelled altogether. On October 4, 1957, the Soviets stunned the world by sending Sputnik into space. As the Americans watched the night sky above them, that pulsing beacon heralded the creation of new devastating Soviet weapons, virtually indefensible long-range nuclear missiles capable of striking anywhere in the world. The Americans and the British were scurrying to build a defensive nuclear shield against such an attack, sometimes with mixed results. The Blue Streak missile would have given Britain a weapon to decapitate the Soviet leadership, but they needed a reliable system for delivering the warheads. This same technology would propel Britain into the space race. The culmination of her efforts came to fruition in 1971. It was then that she dared to put her own satellite into orbit with a homegrown rocket. As test launches continued with the Black Knight, the re-entry vehicle for Blue Streak's nuclear warhead was perfected. Experiments took place on moonless nights, so the luminous wake of re-entry could be photographed more easily. Afterwards, scientists scoured the Woomera terrain for remnants of the rocket for further analysis. In later tests, a second stage, propelled by a solid rocket motor, hurtled the head towards the Earth after the rocket reached the peak of its ascent. This was essentially preparation for firing nuclear warheads at enemy targets. At the same time, the Black Knight's big brother, the Blue Streak, was facing trouble. The Blue Streak rocket had a paper-thin stainless steel skin to make it as light as possible. It was so thin that the rocket needed to be constantly pressurized to keep the structure from collapsing in on itself. This slowed down manufacturing tremendously. By 1960, the Blue Streak still wasn't ready, and the cost of completing the project was pegged at between £550 million and £1.3 billion. There were also fears that even if the Blue Streak was completed, it would be vulnerable to a preemptive Soviet strike.
There was a consolidated awareness that, in fact, the Blue Streak that had been agreed in 1953 and was still very much on its way toward final development and test would be very vulnerable, because what Sputnik said to the informed, which rapidly got to the man in the street through the media, was the fact that this did not represent anything vital in terms of a little bleeping ball going around the Earth, but the rocket that launched it was now capable of sending a nuclear warhead to any target anywhere on Earth from Soviet territory.
Each Blue Streak contained 80 tons of liquid nitrogen, but the frigid liquid could not be stored in the rocket long term. Otherwise it would ice up. It took a full 30 minutes to fuel up and prep the Blue Streak for a launch. Undoubtedly, the Blue Streak could be vaporized before it lifted off by incoming Soviet missiles. De Havilland suggested pairing the missiles and alternating which was ready for launch to minimize icing. But this would have been a logistical headache, and doubled the number of missiles needed to create a defensive grid. As well, there were plans for burying the launch pads in silos to shield the missiles from bomb blasts. The proposed silos would have withstood a 1 megaton bomb blast from half a mile away. However, it would have cost millions of pounds to dig out and construct them in great numbers and suitable sites. There were also social and political ramifications. The average Brit would not feel comfortable with a silo in their backyard. With costs, complications and criticism piling up, it's no surprise that the Blue Streak was cancelled in 1960 when a cheaper alternative appeared from across the Atlantic. Nuclear missile launch sites were static and made for an easy target. But what if an aircraft could be adapted to deliver and fire these weapons? America had moved away from nuclear bombers because they were vulnerable to attack by surface-to-air missiles and interceptors. Next, they moved towards missiles. But once an ICBM was launched, unlike a bomber, it could not be recalled or redirected. Negotiations and peace were off the table. The GAM-87 Skybolt was an attempt at getting the best of both worlds, the flexibility of a nuclear bomber and the invulnerability of a nuclear missile. The Skybolt was an air-launched nuclear missile developed by American aircraft manufacturer Douglas. The plan was to equip B-52s and British V-bombers with this 1 megaton weapon.
The Americans offered Skybolt as an air-launched ballistic missile, which would do the job of Blue Streak, but carried under the fuselage of a Vulcan V-bomber. These were storable weapons that could be lifted off the runway by Vulcans on call following standby. And they had the range of Blue Streak, 1,500 miles. And they would soar out into space 300 miles and dive down just exactly the same as a ballistic missile launched from the ground. So they did the same job, except that they took away targets in the UK, which otherwise would have been targets for Soviet missiles, as the launch sites for Blue Streak, took them away. The airfields for the V-bombers were always going to be nuclear targets. Russians were always going to strike those. But the Vulcans would be gone with their Skybolts, and that's why Skybolt was considered.
The British already had a similar weapon, the Blue Steel missile. However, the GAM-87 promised superior range, enabling bombers to loiter on the edge of Soviet territory. Once given the signal to attack, the bombers could fire the Skybolt into enemy territory, confident that the missile, travelling at over 1,500 kilometers per hour, could deliver a knockout punch. If the strike was designed to knock out defences, the bomber might have a secondary mission, dropping free-fall bombs against additional targets in the Soviet Union. Britain put full confidence in the Skybolt. It was in fact to be her only nuclear deterrent. However, the entire Skybolt program was soon vaporized itself. The US had other superior nuclear weapons in development, including the Polaris and Minutemen missiles. The Polaris missile could be launched from submarines lurking in the depths of the ocean, giving the US mobility and the element of surprise. Minutemen missiles were much more accurate than earlier ballistic missiles, as they had a flight computer on board. There was no problem with having them ready for launch at a minute's notice, as they were solid rockets and did not use liquid nitrogen, which caused icing issues on missiles like the Blue Streak. With these two exceptional weapons available, the Skybolt was deemed expendable, and in 1962 Kennedy officially cancelled the whole program. But what of Britain, who had placed all her bets on the Skybolt? There was outrage in the House of Commons. The UK was left out in the cold, with no nuclear deterrent and with the Soviets practically on its doorstep. An emergency meeting was called between President Kennedy and Prime Minister Macmillan in the Bahamas. The two would hammer out the Nassau Agreement, which guaranteed the UK a supply of Polaris missiles in exchange for leasing a submarine base to the Americans in the Holy Loch, near Glasgow.
The British electorate, when they learned that Polaris was offered in place of Skybolt, were furious over the fact that it seemed to put the lie to the fact that we had an independent nuclear deterrent. And the House of Commons erupted over the fact that suddenly the country was being told by the Americans, you can't have this system because we cancel it, but you can have that. And it seemed as though the Americans were pulling our strings, that the British were in fact puppets of America's nuclear war machine. And so when Polaris was offered, while it made huge sense for the British and offered the British the ability to actually retire the V-bomber aircraft force and have a single offshore nuclear deterrent where there were no targets with nuclear capability operating from UK soil, that nevertheless forever and resonates today with the fact that Britain is reliant on the American missiles, which of course they are, through Poseidon that replaced Polaris and Trident that replaced Poseidon.
The UK had filled their need for a nuclear deterrent, but they had already invested so much time, energy and money into Blue Streak and Black Knight. Was there a way to salvage something of value out of their cancelled rocket programs? In 1962, the Soviets and Americans led the world in the space race. They were neck and neck, spending millions of dollars, and as the months went by, each one was clearly doing everything they could to get the upper hand. But the Soviets always seemed to be a step ahead. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin of the Soviet Union became the first man in space. Less than a month later, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space. Though a remarkable achievement for NASA, it was still an embarrassment for Kennedy. The US, with all its money and industrial might, was still coming in second place. On May 25th, Kennedy challenged his country to go where no man or woman had gone before.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
The UK was still making its own strides in space exploration, and in 1962 they launched the first in a series of aerial satellites. The US was instrumental in all of the launches. They not only provided the rockets, they often constructed the satellites to the specification of British researchers. Each aerial satellite conducted a unique set of experiments, examining phenomena like cosmic rays and solar radiation. It was a great accomplishment for Britain. Only two other countries had their own satellites, namely the Soviets and the US. But it was only possible with American assistance. Britain actually had a successful shorter-range rocket system built on her earlier work with V-2 rockets, called the Skylark.
In Britain, because of the amount of information that the British got from German research, the kind of technologies that were being developed for air-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, those made the British able to develop a generation of rockets that were used called sounding rockets, for putting sounding probes into the upper atmosphere and into space. And emerging out of one of the most amazing developments from British industry was a very powerful sounding rocket called Skylark. And from 1957 to the 1990s, more than 440 were launched, carrying payloads for scientists and experimenters and institutes and universities all over the world.
Some believed that the UK could get all the way into space independently, with a royal rocket of their own. The Black Prince was essentially a blue streak missile with the Black Knight mounted on top, and a solid rocket as the third and final stage. The idea was initially put forward in 1957, the same year Sputnik had gone into space. This princely proposal was revisited in 1960, following the cancellation of the Blue Streak missile. However, the Prince did not have a long reign. Money, as always, was a key issue for the UK government, and they could not find any other backers in the Commonwealth to support the project. The Black Prince was abandoned in favour of a joint space venture with France, several other European countries, and Australia. This new space organisation was ELDO, or the European Launcher Development Programme. They hoped that by sharing the costs and technology, they could make space research and development affordable.
Well, ELDO, the European Launcher Development Organisation, was essentially at the inspiration and instigation of the British. They went to France and to Germany, which had robust propulsion technology programs. There was an indigenous German rocket capability from the Second World War. The companies that had built all of the infrastructure for the V2s and the prolific German rocket program, that was all there. The paperwork and the knowledge and the know-how and the legacy went to the victorious powers in 1945. But Germany held on to a tremendous attraction for rocket technology. And so it was to France and Germany, France with its already robust national satellite program developing, with its rocket program called Diamond, coming out of its sounding rocket program, sending up packages of instruments on ballistic hops above the stratosphere to get information about near-Earth space and the outer atmosphere. So France was a good deal, a good stop-off on the way to Germany to ask for a tripartite discussion that maybe could bring in other European partners. Let's all fund it together. And by the way, here is Blue Streak, big, powerful first stage, bigger than anything else around and on the block at the time.
ELDO's primary task was getting into space successfully, and building the ELDO-A rocket was a top priority. The ELDO-A, later named the Europa-1, was a three-stage rocket, with the Blue Streak occupying stage 1, just like the Black Prince. The rest of the work was divided amongst ELDO's partners. France provided the second stage, the Karelia, and West Germany, the final one, the Astris. Italy worked on the actual satellite project, while the Netherlands and Belgium developed tracking and telemetry systems, and Australia supplied the launch site. In the coming years, much progress was made. Between 1964 and 1972, the Blue Streak was tested multiple times as part of the ELDO project in various Europa rockets. It was also in 1964 that the outgoing Conservative government made an unexpected move. Although they were thoroughly invested in ELDO and the Europa-1, the government approved the RAE's proposal for another launcher system. Britain was to fire its own satellites into space aboard Black Arrows.
But the British were already aware that they could produce, and British technologists and manufacturing firms were aware that they could produce from existing Black Knight gamma engine technology, the gamma engines that have been used in the Black Knight test rocket for Blue Streak. They could put together multiples of these and create a multi-stage satellite launcher. And so that proceeded, and Black Arrow was developed with very low funding to gradually work its way toward the capability of an independent British satellite launch vehicle.
The RAE were keen on launching satellites to test emerging technologies. One area of interest was ion engines, engines which expel ions for thrust. This propulsion system would allow spacecraft, satellites and deep space probes to travel further, faster and more cheaply than any other system available. The Black Arrow was a direct descendant of the Black Knight. Much of the staff from Saunders-Roe's initial project were transferred to the Black Arrow. Westlands became the primary contractor when Saunders Roe merged with the company in 1964, while Bristol Siddeley was still responsible for the engines. The project faced some early hurdles. It was initially put on hold by an incoming Labour government looking to reduce expenditures. Work resumed 2 years later after the 1966 election. The new government gave the green light to a scaled-down version of the project with fewer launches. However, footing a large portion of the bill for a secondary launch system, Eldo's Europa rocket was just too expensive for the cash-conscious government.
Europa was proceeding on technologically sound lines toward the production of a European satellite launcher. The cost of it was increasing, and the British government decided to pull out. That incensed the French to the point where they went it alone and produced the Ariane launch vehicle, which today is launching half the world's satellite traffic.
Britain still maintained a role in the Europa development, though, in a greatly diminished capacity, while she focused on her own homegrown rocket. The Black Arrow was back on track, with a launch date expected in 1968. Its first stage had exactly the same diameter as the Coralia, the second stage of the Europa rocket. This was intentional. It gave Britain a backup for the Coralia and allowed the possibility of stacking the Black Arrow on top of the Blue Streak, thus creating an even more powerful rocket. Black Arrow's first test launch was on June 28, 1969 in Woomera, Australia. This was to be a test for the first and second stages only. It was far too risky to send up a satellite this early in the program. This was a wise decision. There was an electrical problem that caused the combustion chamber to pivot back and forth. The rocket rolled erratically after clearing the launch pad. After the first stage failed completely, the Black Arrow fell back to Earth and was detonated by launch officials. It wasn't the start the researchers had hoped for.
The test problems were essentially based upon the fact that this was a much bigger rocket. And it's not easy just to simply say, OK, we'll just put more at the base and have a bigger rocket. There were all kinds of complex problems that evolved from that.
Less than 3 weeks later, NASA wrote a new chapter in space exploration history. For the first time, a human walked on the moon. The Apollo 11 crew of Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin took this fantastic voyage aboard a Saturn V rocket. A rocket designed in large part by Wernher von Braun. America had won the race to the moon, but it was a great achievement to be shared by all of humankind. The success of Apollo 11 must have been inspiring to the Black Arrow's team. Fortunately, the Black Arrow's early failure did not leave a black mark on its career, and tests resumed. The early bugs were ironed out of the system, and the second launch went up without a hitch. It was time to see if the Black Arrow could put a satellite into orbit. The third arrow in the quiver was set to launch on the 2nd of September 1970. It had a promising start. Stage 1 burnt and separated successfully. However, an oxidizer leak in Stage 2 meant that rocket could not reach orbit. This would be the most costly failure for the program. In July of 1971, the entire Black Arrow program was cancelled.
We were used to our government cancelling projects. At Saunders Roe we were working on a mixed unit fighter aircraft, which is a wonderful aircraft, and that was just cancelled. If they couldn't afford something, they just cancelled it. No problem to them at all.
As with all of Britain's earlier rocket programs, money was the main issue. It was deemed too costly for Britain to build her own rockets. Private sector launches would have been one way for the government to recoup some of its investment. However, the Black Arrow could carry a small 100-kilogram payload only, and was not suitable for launching commercial satellites, which were getting larger and more complicated. Furthermore, Britain did not have an ideal launch site for putting objects into orbit.
Woomera is a very good test area, but it's not very good for launching satellites that may have a commercial application, because you need to launch from close to the equator. The Americans, being relatively close to the equator with Cape Canaveral, 28 degrees north, that's all, you have to give them the advantage there.
William Penny, best known as the father of Britain's atomic program, was asked to evaluate the Black Arrow project. His recommendations may have been the death knell for the Arrow. Black Arrow has no alternative use, and the nation would have much to gain and little to lose if it were cancelled in favour of American launchers. We would be abandoning a certain political independence and a guarantee of commercial security payments, but on these 2 points, satisfactory safeguards should be available from the US authorities. America had been to the moon and back, and it would have been no great feat for them to put future British satellites into orbit on board their scout rockets. NASA had even offered to launch British payloads for free, an offer which was ultimately withdrawn. It seemed as if Britain might never launch a satellite into orbit on her own. Britain's involvement with Eldo was equally unfruitful. By June 12, 1970, there had been 10 launches of Europa rockets, with 4 successes, 1 terminated launch, and 5 failures. Unfortunately, all the attempts at satellite launches had been unsuccessful. Britain still had one last chance to put her own satellite into space. That is, if the Black Arrow could somehow fire a puck into orbit. The Prospero satellite, also known as the X-3, and the puck, was designed to conduct experiments on telecommunication satellite components. It was a British-made satellite, and the 4th Black Arrow rocket was slated to bring it into space. Though the Black Arrow project had been cancelled, the rocket had already been shipped to the Australian launch site. So close to success, the Black Arrow team defied the government's decision. Still waiting for the formal cancellation orders to arrive, Technical Director Raymond Wheeler decided to give it one more go. With scientists and engineers monitoring their controls, the launch clock ticked down. Ignition. Out of a cloud of smoke, the Black Arrow rose into the sky like a phoenix out of the flame. Prospero was successfully released and began broadcasting a steady signal as it circled around the globe. The Black Arrow had finally hit the mark. It was a great success at long last for Britain and her space program, though it was, in some ways, an embarrassment to the British government, as the Black Arrow engineers had just proven them wrong in spectacular fashion. The Black Arrow team had much for which to rejoice. Though they had overcome considerable adversity, for Technical Director Raymond Wheeler, it was just another day at the office.
This was just routine, ordinary work to us. We expected it to work, and it did.
It was a bittersweet victory. Operations were shut down on the Isle of Wight, and Saunders Roe shuttered their rocket launch program. Many scientists and engineers were let go and would have to look elsewhere to pursue their dreams of space. Though the Black Arrow program was laid to rest, from its ashes, Britain would emerge as a leader in satellite technology.
The launch of Prospero was a huge boost, a tremendous fillip, emotionally and technologically. We had now probed every aspect of what it was to be a spacefaring nation. Rockets, guidance and control systems, propulsion systems, handling and test, all of those things associated with getting a rocket working. Manufacturing and building a satellite completely without the help of anybody else, and having it attached to a vehicle so that it could separate and operate and continue to send scientific results from space. That was really all that industry needed. And from that point, industry invested, consolidated, worked its way back into the satellite programs of Europe and globally to become one of the largest providers today in this new century of satellite manufacturers around the world. And as part of a European consortium, it has returned to the very market that it's turned its back on with the cancellation of Blue Streak and the removal of that rocket as the first stage of Europa, which itself gave birth to Ariane. So while Britain is no longer in the propulsion business, Prospero began a line of development that saw this country one of the biggest manufacturing producers of high-tech satellites in the world.
Here, on the Isle of Wight, only a few remnants remain of Britain's indigenous rocket program. The sophisticated launch facility is now largely in ruins, just like the old fort that preceded it. Still, the significance of the rocket program has not been erased by time. It lives on in the armada of British satellites circling the globe, including Prospero itself. It may have been deactivated in 1996, but it remains a beacon of that one triumphant day in 1971.
On the 17th of August, 1966, the only prototype to have flown of Britain's most advanced aircraft project was towed down this road. It flew just 24 times, and the £200 million that had been spent on its research and development was eventually to be reduced to just £50,000 worth of scrap. This is an aircraft graveyard at Shoebury in Essex, where once proud aeroplanes are used as targets to test the effects of gunfire and shrapnel. Such was the fate of TSR-2. What remains today of the TSR-2 project can only be found in museums, standing as testimony to the decisions that sealed its fate. Conceived in the 1950s, designed and flown in the early 60s, the story of TSR-2 is one of technological triumph and human endeavor. It was an aircraft years ahead of its time. The years 1950 to 1957 could be described as the post-war golden age of the British aircraft industry. Shop floors were full of priority orders resulting from the Korean War panic. Design offices were working flat out on a whole series of advanced operational requirements for the RAF and the Navy. The Farnborough air shows revealed a procession of advanced prototypes and piloted scale models of shapes to come. Then, in 1957, the Secretary of State for Defense, Duncan Sands, presented his Defense White Paper to Parliament, which called for the elimination of manned aircraft in favor of missile systems. This left Britain's aircraft industry and the Royal Air Force with just one key project to pursue: the replacement of the highly successful and widely exported Canberra bomber.
On the sort of aircraft we were looking at, we'd already looked at the idea of a specialized low-level bomber. And that was cancelled in early 56, I think for quite good reasons, as it was such a narrow role for an aircraft. And we felt we still should go for low level because we saw it as the only means of penetrating Soviet air defenses. But equally, we wanted it to be able to put on a reasonable performance at altitude. And I'm talking anywhere between 40 and 60,000 feet. I say that because we visualize air operated engines, ordinary turbojets, in other words. We weren't thinking of things like ramjets or anything. And we called it tactical strike reconnaissance aircraft, hoping that that would convey the idea of our operational technique.
Meanwhile, the Royal Navy had not been idle in identifying its requirement for a low-flying strike aircraft. In 1955, Blackburn Aircraft won the contract to develop the NA-39 Buccaneer, a twin-seat carrier-borne strike aircraft capable of flying under the enemy's surface vessel radar screen. The Navy had a powerful ally in Lord Louis Mountbatten, who, as Chief of the Defence Staff and a lifelong naval officer, tried to persuade the RAF to opt for a modified version of the Buccaneer as the Canberra replacement. Whilst this would have helped to reduce the costs for the Navy and ultimately the Air Force, the RAF felt that the Buccaneer would not fulfill their requirements.
Now, the Buccaneer was an extraordinarily successful airplane. It was built mainly for low-level work. But the point was that the RAF didn't think it was, at that stage, was fast enough or good enough high up. There was nothing wrong with the Buccaneer. And contrary to the popular belief, and you may be very interested to hear this, that in 1956, I asked Barry Late, who was then the chief designer of Blackburns, if he would very kindly produce a brochure for me on the NA-39 for the Royal Air Force. And he did that, and we did consider it. It was very seriously considered. Mountbatten used to rather lie about that and say we never took any interest, but it was very seriously considered by the Air Force.
Now, I think the real tragedy is that the Tories should have had the sense to develop the Buccaneer into a strike reconnaissance aircraft for the Air Force, but the Air Force wouldn't agree to that. And Varel Begg later told me that he thought that the decision to go for the TSR-2 was, in a sense, compensation to the Air Force for the government's decision to give the nuclear deterrent to the Navy. And Varel Begg was head of the Navy.
By March 1957, the RAF began to circulate its basic requirement under the title General Operational Requirement 339. The industry were to report back with designs and comments by January 1958. But in September 1957, the government dropped another bombshell on the industry. At Chelmeix House, the permanent secretary at the Ministry of Supply called a meeting of the heads of all the major aircraft companies and told them that following the 57 Defence White Paper, there was no certainty of further aircraft projects except GOR 339. He also told them that proposals would only be accepted from those firms who were prepared to collaborate together on the project. The government had effectively aimed a pistol at the industry's head. The message was amalgamate or die. The companies spent hundreds of thousands of man-hours developing their concepts. Amongst them, Vickers Armstrong, who came up with a single and twin-engine version of their Type 571, which was to be based on the new concept of a fully integrated airframe, engine, equipment, and weapons system. English Electric was the only British company to have built an operational supersonic aircraft in the Lightning. They proposed their P-17, provided with a VTOL capability by the P-17D from Shorts, who'd been gaining valuable experience in vertical takeoff with their SC-1.
The P-17 concept was a very, very good one. And if you look at the general arrangement drawings of it, superimposed on a picture of the TSR-2, you'll find that outwardly there's very little difference.
The P-17 was to ride piggyback on the P-17D to give it a full vertical takeoff capability. The P-17D, which was powered by no fewer than 70 engines, was to enable the P-17 to take off and land back on the platform in the air.
English Electric had got the measure of the supersonic bomber aspect absolutely right, but their solution to providing the short field takeoff and landing capability with this lifting platform, I think would have been immensely difficult to do, very costly, and I had some doubts as to its practicability. I didn't think it would work.
The P-17D was dropped after the RAF redefined their requirement as OR-343, based solely on the Vickers English Electric submissions. Initially, the enforced amalgamation of the two companies was not welcomed.
Well, frankly, we thought it was absolutely wrong. We thought it was a misjudgment which would lead to cost overrun, delays, unnecessarily complications in working out this very complex design, which could much more easily have been done by one firm as a main contractor. And if that one firm didn't have the total manufacturing capacity to cope with the whole program, then they should have subcontracted it out to the other parts of the industry that could take it on.
English Electric had already 10 years' experience in building supersonic military aircraft. No other firm in this country had. They had the Canberra behind them, and they had a design known as the P-17, which was very close indeed to the specification which was put down subsequently for TSR-2. And nevertheless, the prime contract was given to Vickers. It's true to say that their experience lay in subsonic aircraft and in civil aircraft. The only military plane, I think, that they built was the Valiant bomber, which had manifest structural faults in design and was in fact withdrawn after 5 years, so you could say it was a failure. And yet, in spite of the contrast between the two firms' experience and capability, they were told to amalgamate, and the prime contract was given to Vickers. I think it was mistaken.
English Electric were regarded by the rest of the industry as newcomers. The great names, Hawkers, de Havillands, Vickers, Bristols, had been companies existing to way back to World War I and even earlier. English Electric, the name English Electric only came into the general public view after World War II. They had built very successfully a range of Hampden and Halifax bombers under license from Handley Page during the war. And then on the basis of that, a new design team was formed in 1945, specifically to design and build for the RAF its first jet bomber, the Canberra. English Electric were regarded as newcomers by the rest of industry, and I think slightly resented for that.
By any standards at that time, TSR-2 was to be the most advanced aircraft in the world. It was to be capable of around Mach 1.1 at 200 feet and Mach 2 at medium and high altitudes with a radius of action of 1,000 nautical miles. The aircraft would need a completely new, fully automatic radar system, more advanced than anything else in existence, including terrain following and sideways-looking radar with automatic updating of data. It was to be capable of taking a full reconnaissance fit, operate from short strips in all weather, and provide everything from long-range nuclear strike to battlefield support. No self-defense weapons were initially proposed, although there was a provision to carry 4 air-to-surface rockets. The government's choice of the Bristol Siddeley Olympus engine was a controversial decision and was to lead to delays and massive cost overruns.
We were strongly in favour of a Rolls-Royce engine, not least because we considered that the Bristol Olympus development wasn't far ahead, and that we would end up with in the classic situation which should be avoided in aircraft development. That's a new design of aeroplane with a new design of engine right from flight one. That complicates the issues. Wherever you can, you should combine a new aeroplane with a well-proven engine.
Rolls-Royce at that day, they didn't want all these aircraft to succeed with Bristol engines. And this was before Rolls-Royce bought up Bristol. The TSR-2 was going to have the Bristol Olympus. The 1154 was going to have a form of the Bristol Pegasus. And this really didn't suit Rolls-Royce at all at the time.
Undoubtedly, the development costs of the Olympus were a big factor in the escalating costs of the program, but much worse than that, in my view, was the unreliability of the engine. We did actually, to use the phrase I have just used, arrive at a classic situation where we had a brand new untried aeroplane with an engine which was not only unproved, and it hadn't passed its airworthiness type tests, but it actually had a known catastrophic failure on it, which put the TSR-2 prototype at risk when we started flying.
Problems with the engine would prove difficult to resolve and were not identified until after the first flight. The Vulcan Olympus flying testbed would later blow up whilst taxiing. The government placed the contract for 9 pre-production aircraft with the Vickers English Electric Consortium in October 1960, more than 18 months after the contract had first been announced. In spite of mounting opposition from the Navy and the Treasury, Britain's most ambitious aircraft project yet devised had been given the go-ahead. Vickers, under Sir George Edwards, was to be the prime contractor and responsible for the front fuselage section, which included the cockpit, weapon systems, and budget control. English Electric, led by its chief designer, Freddie Page, was to concentrate on the aerodynamics, wings, tail, and rear fuselage. From an early stage, the consortium responded to the project's critics in Whitehall by illustrating their design philosophy, as seen in this film extract presented by their chief project engineer, Ollie Heath.
With a tailplane so designed as to release the whole of the wing fore-flap blowing, the provision of adequate thrust-to-weight ratio secured by powerful Olympus 22R engines, giving a thrust-to-weight ratio of 0.6, the requirement for rudimentary field operation by large wheels, which despite the requirements for low cross-sectional area are stowed within the aeroplane without drag penalty. The crosswind requirements met by the large parachute, which of course also confers the short landing facility. The
advanced technology of the aircraft was mirrored in the complexity of the manufacturing, which was to employ new working practices and advanced materials. Other problems relating to project management control would lead to delays.
One of the most delaying aspects of the program was that many of the subcontractors were working directly with the ministry and not under the control of the central management organization, that is BAC. And this led to complications, misunderstandings, and inevitable delays. I remember one famous occasion when one of the committees that I attended of industry and the ministry officials and civil servants from the establishments and elsewhere, the chairman took a look round the room when we started in St Giles Court, long room, full of cigarette smoke and battered cups of tea. And he took a look round the room. He said, "I want a count taken." And there was a head count taken at this meeting, and there were 58 people in the room. And the chairman quite reasonably said, "This is quite ridiculous. Nobody could control a program with meetings this size. I want you all to go away, and the next meeting is convened for such and such a date, and I want to see a significant reduction in the numbers at that meeting." And in due course, we all came back to the reconvened meeting, and there were 61 in the room.
The ministry, for instance, annexed control of the cockpit layout, I think arbitrarily at some point. And there was a civil servant in the ministry who was in charge, and I quote, "as far as the government was concerned." But there are a lot more to it than that. I think the contractor had a seat on his committee, but that didn't represent control either.
In my own experience, we had cockpit committee meetings which spent days not only just trying to decide where one particular switch should go, but what the caption should be under the switch. And then they decided, against the advice of the operators, in that case me, to put a caption under a vital switch, which made no sense to the aircrew at all. And eventually, before we flew, it had to be changed. And this is a typical example of the very simple, silly delays that occurred in the program.
In the United States, the advanced technology and potential of TSR-2 had been a source of concern, and progress of the project had been closely monitored.
They sent a team over from the Pentagon in 1960 under an official called Cortlandt Perkins, and they went all over the TSR-2 building. They expressed enormous enthusiasm. They let the British Aircraft Corporation, they let them understand that they would be interested in purchasing. They were nothing of the kind. They were interested in finding out what was going on in order to adapt it into their own version, which came much later and much less successfully, the F-111. Now, I don't blame the Americans.
Well, I think it's become very clear since those days that the Americans were primarily very worried about the emergence of TSR-2 because they saw it as a direct challenge to the military air supremacy that they were aiming to establish with their F-111 swing-wing low-level attack airplane, which was designed for a very similar role to TSR-2.
Early in 1960, American industry was asked what at the time seemed impossible. It was asked to design an airplane that would fly faster at any altitude than any existing fighter.
It was behind it in time. It ran into enormous technical problems, and it overran its cost predictions very, very greatly. But we know that the Americans thought that the TSR-2 was a threat, that if we had been as successful with TSR-2 as we had been with its predecessor, the Canberra, which was so good, if you remember, that the Americans themselves bought the Canberra, I think they saw the TSR as a threat to their potential worldwide interest in exporting military airplanes, and they were very anxious to get rid of it.
The Australians, who had also purchased the Canberra bomber, found themselves in a similar position to the RAF in looking for a suitable replacement.
I think the Australians needed to replace their cannons, and therefore, as they usually did, they looked to Britain and said, "What are you doing? You must be replacing yours."
I made 2 visits to Canberra with teams from British Aerospace to make presentations on the TSR-2 program, during which we understand that they were planning to acquire 30 airframes. Royal Air Force was planning to have 150, and this 30 would have made a nice addition to and made the production run really stable. During the early part of 1964 was the year in which the airplane first flew. We understood that the Australian government had virtually signed up for a contract for TSR-2.
After more than 5 years' work, the first prototype, XR-219, was transported in sections to the Aircraft and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down in Wiltshire, where it would take 3 months to assemble. The choice of Boscombe Down as the site of the flight test program was a compromise solution. English Electric's base at Wartime in Lancashire would have been an ideal support and maintenance base. Vickers had wanted the first flight to take place from their airfield at Wisley. Roland Beaumont argued that the Wisley runway was too short. Working from Boscombe Down would create more problems.
Nobody really wanted us there. Oh, they did their very best to help us, I must say. We didn't want to be there. We had the worst of both communication worlds. We were 150 miles from Moreton and 60 miles from Weybridge, where we ought to have been doing all that work on one base with all the experts just round the block.
The sum total of delays and resultant cost increases that were plaguing the project meant the planned in-service date had to be put back. This news poured further fuel on the fire of mounting opposition from the project's critics. Mountbatten, perhaps TSR-2's most determined critic, was still pushing hard for the Buccaneer. He visited Australia and met their Defence Minister, Sir Frederick Sherger.
He said that it would, he went round the place saying that it was absolutely what the Air Force wanted, and everybody knew this. And he used to go around with a briefcase with one model of the TSR-2 and 5 of the Buccaneers, and put them on the table in front of people like Sherger in Australia, and say, you can have 5 of these for 1 of those, so why do you bother?
Mountbatten, to the best of my knowledge, told them they wouldn't be coming into service, or certainly poured cold water on it.
The Australians listened to us, and by the time we started flying in August, we had been given to understand that the Australians were almost certainly shifting and going for the F-111.
I'm sure they would have bought the TSR-2 had it gone ahead.
The newly assembled and freshly painted TSR-2 was wheeled out in September 1964 to commence its engine runs and taxi trials. Roland Beaumont and other members of his flight test team still had nagging concerns about the unresolved engine and undercarriage problems. The continuing buildup of political pressure and adverse media criticism was heightened by the looming general election, with the ruling Conservative government looking set to lose. Meanwhile, a meeting was convened at Boscombe Down. In view of the October election and the Labour Party's uncertain support for the project, The question on everybody's lips was, when could TSR-2 make its first flight? A successful flight before the election might prove critical to the project's survival. The chief project test pilot was faced with a very difficult decision. He was well aware of the dangers of an engine failure and of the consequences of cancellation.
Don Bowen, my observer, backseater, and I were the people on whom the total responsibility of this enormous pyramidal organization were going to fall on Flight 1. But it wasn't a sudden precipice to go over. We'd been doing taxi trials on the aeroplane, testing all its systems out on the ground. We'd taxied it up to takeoff speed, tested the parachute, the brakes and all the rest of it. By the time we were ready to fly on that day, I had any doubts about the capability of the aeroplane had long since gone. I was very confident that it was going to fly well. It's an extraordinarily good moment when you turn onto the runway, you call for clearance to go, you get clearance from the tower, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, brakes off. You light the reheat and go, and from then on, you know exactly what it's supposed to do, and your task is just to be totally alert to see if it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It's a fascinating moment. It's professionally enormously satisfying. And then when you come airborne and you'll find this new device actually performs as well as predicted, or even in the case of TSR-2 better. We scheduled to fly the TSR-2 first flight for 30 minutes. We in fact flew for 27 minutes. Halfway through that, at the end of the first circuit round Boston, I had formed the opinion that this was far more than a questionable aeroplane. This was a brilliant first attempt at getting this complex aeroplane right. It was so good and so right on Flight 1 after 10 minutes that I was enjoying the sensation of just relaxing and feeling this is a marvelous aeroplane. I felt I'd been there before.
The first flight had demonstrated the potential of the aircraft, but for technical reasons it was not to fly again until the very last day of the year. In the meantime, there'd been a change of government. On the 16th of October, the results of the polls confirmed the predicted Labour win. Out went the Tories, and with them went government backing for TSR-2. The fate of TSR-2 was now in the hands of the new Labour administration.
I'm certain they were evasive. And I looked at the Labour Party manifesto to see whether it said anything about it just the other day. And it's pretty uninformative. Attacked the government, of course, for the way in which the aviation industry had been handled in the previous 10, 13 years. That's standard stuff. But it didn't contain any real commitment to the TSR-2 in particular. And I think in Preston there was some promise put about in the campaign there that the SO2 will be safe under Labour, but I don't think there was any other indication that they were committed to it, and they were, as I say, I think, pretty evasive.
Yes, well, we ran into a number of unexpected problems at Boston Down. First of all, it was planned that I should fly it for the first 4 or 5 flights until I was satisfied with its handling qualities, because you have continuity of experience. The more you fly a new type of airplane, obviously the safer the flying becomes, because you're on a learning curve. On flight 2, we had a very severe vibration problem. We had it again on flight 3. These were engine-associated problems, or engine system-associated problems. And then on flight 5, we had a major undercarriage malfunction, which could have lost us the prototype. It was actually an abandoned aircraft case had we chosen to take that road. But in consultation with Don Bowen in the back, I said, "Okay, Don, here's your opportunity to try out Martin Baker." That was the ejection seat. And he said, "What are you going to do, B?" And I said, "I think I'm going to try and land it." And there was a long pause from the back, and he said, "You're not going to get rid of me that easily. I'm staying." And so we landed it with the undercarriage in the wrong place. There were a number of problems with the undercarriage. The first one we encountered was sequencing. The undercarriage was not carrying out the correct sequencing in raising and lowering, and that took some time to get right. The next one was that it was what's known as a long stroke undercarriage to absorb this great shock. This, in fact, resulted in it being quite flexible fore and aft. And from the first landing onwards, we found when we touched down with this airplane, the undercarriage literally twanged. It swung back as we touched the ground. It caused vibrations to run right through the airframe and to reach the crew area, the cockpit in the nose of the airplane, as a very powerful lateral oscillation. You had an oscillation which was about the same rate as the natural frequency of the human eyeball. So that at the moment you touched down, you stopped being able to see the runway for a fraction of a second.
The very nature of test flying will invariably throw up the occasional dramatic moment.
That was a one-off. It was a pilot on his first flight on the airplane. He hadn't quite understood the dynamics of the airplane, and he'd got his approach slightly wrong, and he touched down at a very high rate of descent. When we got to flight 20, I think it was, up at Wartime, we were clear of all the minor snags on the airplane, and we thought now's the time to get on to curing this or investigating this undercarriage problem. The first thing to do was to measure the difference between touching down on a dry runway and touching down on a very reduced coefficient of friction runway, low mu. That was obtained by getting the fire brigade to spread foam on the runway, and Jimmy Dowdell touched down on the foam with the onboard vibration sensors measuring the vibration set up at that point, and they were then directly compared with the similar vibrations caused on touching down on a dry runway. That was all part of the research to get that one right. It became apparent that the next and vital stage of the flight development of the airplane was going to need expertise, knowledge and facilities which didn't exist at the Weybridge end of the consortium. They existed in large measure at Wartime, and this type of airplane was right within Wartime's expertise. So it gradually became apparent in the management of the program that thinking changed towards moving the first prototype and the subsequent flight development, which was going to be at least 3 years and 3,500 hours of testing in toto up to Wartime, under the charge of Freddie Page, who was the chief designer.
Flight 14 was not simply a return home. Roland Beaumont, having satisfied himself that the aircraft was performing as planned, took TSR-2 supersonic for the first and only time. Engaging reheat on just one engine, the acceleration was such that he left Jimmy Dell behind, even though he had engaged full reheat on both Avon engines of his Lightning.
This new aeroplane was, despite its difficulties, despite its management problems, despite the rather unpleasant and hazardous faults that had occurred in some of the first few flights, it was now showing itself to be a tremendous thoroughbred. It was going to be a wonderful aeroplane. It was already extraordinarily satisfying to fly as a professional. I had been looking forward enormously to shaking the dust of Boscombe off my feet, figuratively, and flying this aeroplane back to my own base, where even the voice of the air traffic controllers were my friend. And we flew back into that environment, we brought it home, and now we were going to get on with it, and no holds barred. A very good feeling.
"17 aircraft that formed the development batch were in varying states of readiness at the factories. The second prototype, XR-220, was at Boscombe Down and programmed for its first flight on the 6th of April 1965. But the gathering momentum of opinion against the project had become unstoppable.
I can't be sure when the decision was taken in Cabinet, but the decision was taken in the relevant Cabinet committee on the same occasion as we decided to cancel the P1154 and the transport aircraft. But Wilson was very frightened because there was much more public interest in the TSR-2 than the other aircraft to put it in the same package. So he asked us to delay it until the budget in April. And that's when the formal decision was taken and announced.
He called the contractors at midday to the ministry on the day in which cancellation was to be announced in the budget debate, and he told them that it was going to be cancelled. So immediately they did what any reasonable person would. They requested permission to ring up their workforce, to ring up their factories, and to warn everybody themselves rather than allow them to learn about this frightful blow in their lives over the radio or the newspaper. And Roy Jenkins refused. He said it was a budget secret.
Quite extraordinary. And we never got a satisfactory explanation of why it was done that way. And I still don't understand why it was done that way, because it was an insult to the House to make an announcement in that particular form where there was no possibility of questioning at all.
Oh, it was just a feeling of inevitability. We'd been struggling. We'd put every possible effort, and when I say we, I mean the whole workforce, all the engineers, the ground staff, the aircrew, of course, flight developers, the airworthiness people, administrators backing it all up, had been working on an all-hours basis. There was no knock-off time. You worked on through the night. Leave was cancelled. Family arrangements were disrupted. Tensions developed in families because husbands were overworked, overstressed. This had been going on for years.
Well, I think there was a tremendous feeling of letdown initially. It was a terrible disappointment to a lot of people who were thoroughly committed to the project, which was just beginning to fly and literally taking off.
Everybody who was concerned with the efficiency of the Air Force thought that the TSR-2 would be too late in service to meet the Air Force's needs. That was the first thing. Secondly, its cost had tripled in the 4 years before I got in. Its time of delivery had extended by 3 years, and there was no guarantee they'd have kept to the cost and timing as I was given it.
Well, I think the nail in the coffin, the sort of trigger reason, was when the Australians refused to buy it and opted for the American plane at the beginning of 1964.
In order not to waste all the knowledge and the potential knowledge to be gained from these things, and also, of course, with an eye on trying to keep people in employment, not only in our factories, but in the component factories and suppliers, we put forward a program to the ministry within 2 weeks of cancellation, proposing that the two prototypes should be kept on, I think, a 100-hour test and development program for research into the future Concorde test program, because they're very similar types of airplane. Much valuable information was being gained, and I think we put it forward on the basis of a fixed price contract, and we were asking for £1.5 million to do 100 hours of concentrated research.
Roy Jenkins said that means it must cost at least $2 million, and in my experience you've got to double that, and that means $4 million, and that's too much. So there was a complete shock.
Following the cancellation came one of the most bizarre episodes in the history of British aviation. For some, it appeared that the cancellation of TSR-2 was not enough. Orders were given to destroy everything.
The massive publicity was given, obviously with official blessing, to operatives in our factories who had actually built these airframes, dragging them out onto the tarmac, shoving oily rags in them and setting fire to them, particularly to the magnesium areas, which burned like a holocaust.
I think it's the most shameful aspect of this sad story. There is no sort of reason whatsoever except what you could really describe as a selfish determination to ensure that that aeroplane would never be built under any other circumstances or in the future. I never heard anybody connected with this project who was other than shocked by this decision. I can't tell you who took it, but the finger must point at the government in one department or other.
Well, it wasn't ordered by me, I can tell you that. Absolutely not. And I don't think it was ordered by Roy Jenkins, who was the only other minister who would have had a say.
I know then that I just had the immense dramatic task of inviting some hundreds of my staff to consider the fact that they were going to be made redundant. And all these dedicated people of high skills were just shown their cards. Many of them went to America, of course.
In America, in 1964, the F-111 was taking shape. Following meetings with Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, Dennis Healy had become convinced that the F-111 would fulfill the RAF's requirements, whilst being cheaper and in service earlier than TSR-2. Events would prove him wrong, as this project also ran into problems of delay and spiralling costs, a fact that the Australians would later come to pay dearly for. Whilst Dennis Healey was talking to McNamara, Prime Minister Wilson was meeting President Johnson to discuss a number of areas of mutual interest. Wilson wanted US backing for the pending loan from the IMF. The thinking back in Britain was that the Americans had extracted a heavy price for their support by demanding the cancellation of TSR-2.
I don't think international diplomacy operates quite so crudely as that. We wanted good relations with the Americans, but there was never any suggestion in my mind that a condition for having IMF support. The Americans wanted a variety of things. They wanted to sustain sterling as a sort of auxiliary currency to the dollar.
The IMF had already decided a week earlier to give us the loan we needed. And we got the necessary loan from other governments as well. So that didn't enter into the discussions in any way.
They wanted us to maintain East of Suez Road, as it were, to share a world road with us. And they were quite keen to, not specifically that we should cancel the TSR-2, but they would like us to buy the F-111, for exactly the same reason that we would like the Australians to buy the TSR-2.
Britain did order the F-111, but ironically, the deal would later fall victim to exactly the same problems that plagued TSR-2. In the interim, the RAF found themselves having to deal with the gap that TSR-2's cancellation had caused.
What we had to do when it was removed from the program was to start innovating, improvising, and making good the shortfall. And that's something which the Royal Air Force historically has always been extremely good at. And of course what we did was to plan and reprogram and retrain the V-Force so that it could go low level for part of its attacks. That was one of the moves that we put on the board in order to make good the deficiency of the TSR-2. Well, I think TSR-2 is probably an example, and it's wrong to lay down the law on the matter when when you don't know all the facts and haven't got access to all the books and records. But I think it is an example, and we've seen far too many of them before and since, and even to this day, of British governments not seeming to value the importance of a thriving aerospace industry.
I think what was the case was that that I and some other people too, Chancellor Jim Callaghan, George Brown, who was first Secretary of State, thought, and I think thought with some justification, that the aircraft industry was consuming too large a proportion of our research and development resources, and also that it was too keen, for understandable reasons, not unworthy reasons, it was too keen on breaching the frontiers of knowledge on aircraft design, rather than concentrating on making and selling planes which it could make and sell.
Well, nobody, it's 30 years now, and nobody has ever in that time given me a clear and reasonable explanation of why it was cancelled.
I called my book The Murder of TSR-2, and that, I believe, is exactly what happened. Though to put your finger precisely on the murderer is less easy. There were a good many.
It was August the 17th, 1966, when the fuselage arrived. Previously to that, 2 or 3 days before that, we'd had a couple of TSR wings arrived here at Shoeburyness, White City. They all came in bit by bit, and we then proceeded to build it up until the state that it is on that picture behind me on our apron. It was quite a showpiece. It was a beautiful aircraft. It was way ahead of its time, so we was informed. And I personally think it was a criminal act to get rid of it as it was done. But it was our job in them days to destruct, to test the vulnerability of fuselages, systems, wings, anything like that. That is our job. Unfortunately, the TSR was one of them. And when she finally met her death here, there were several of us that was very, very sad. And we remember very well to this day. We have got one or two little bits and pieces of her still remaining, but nothing of any size or bulk. The only one that flew, she was destroyed, which I feel very sad about.
In the end, TSR-2 fell victim to the many factors that conspired against it. Politics, both national and international, inter-service rivalry, and an unwieldy management structure, all ensured that delays and escalating costs became inevitable. If the cancellation of the project was the result of a callous political decision, then TSR-2 was also a victim of its own ambition.
I think it was a bridge too far. I think it was a very ambitious, expensive, and at the same time extremely capable military aeroplane, which was perhaps too far advanced for our Air Force and our Ministry of Procurement to cope with. The concept was probably too great for them. They hadn't grown up. They should have done. You know, it's all been done since, and we'd got a long way to doing it then. But this was actually fundamentally lack of faith in the ability of our aircraft industry to produce those sort of goods. We were, in fact, leading the world at the time, but the actions of the politicians made sure we would never do it again.
I was quite astonished to know what it was because it had no propeller.
And John replied, "Oh, it's easy, old boy, it just sucks itself along like a hoover." There was the awful race against time. There was the skullduggery.
She used to say, "Oh, well, Daddy's doing something very hush-hush."
I thought, my goodness, why didn't I think of this before? And it seemed so obvious then.
A small English church is the last resting place of a man who didn't just change the face of the earth. He enabled us to see what it actually looked like. His name was Frank Whittle. This is the story of how he invented the jet engine. He overcame all the odds, only to see the British government almost throw his idea away and miss a chance to shorten the Second World War.
I was born on June the 1st, 1907 in Coventry. My parents were working class. My father was a foreman in machine tool manufacturers. I lived there in Coventry for 9 years, went to an elementary school there. And then the family moved to Leamington Spa because my father bought a small, very small, engineering outfit called the Leamington Valve and Piston Ring Company. And I really did get my first engineering experiences there because I helped him sometimes for, I think it was about twopence an hour or something like that, making slots in valve stems.
In Leamington, Frank also won a scholarship to the town's secondary school.
I was very lazy with homework and got a series of raspberries for that. But at the end of term, I would often do quite well. For instance, I'd come top of maths, something like that. I never did win a prize at school. But I did an awful lot of private study. I used to go down to the library in Leamington Spa and study all sorts of things which are not in the school curriculum. And that was where I first started to learn about gas turbines. I was always attracted to flying from my earliest years almost. When I was 4, my favourite toy, and this was 1911, was a tin model of a Blériot. And my heroes were people like Captain Albert Ball and Major McCudden and so on, the VCs of the First World War, and I just wanted to fly. And also I thought that boys in the uniform of aircraft apprentices looked very good. So I decided I'd like to wear that uniform and applied to join as an apprentice.
The Royal Air Force, however, rejected young Whittle. He was too small.
I was sunk for the time being, but before I left the camp, a very kindly physical training sergeant, if you can imagine such a thing, took pity on me, and he gave me a diet to follow and a series of exercises, max holding exercises. I did all that for 6 months. I put on 3 inches on height and 3 inches on my chest. So I thought, well, I'll have another shot. And I wrote to the ministry, but they said, no, once you've been turned down, you've been turned down forever. So I thought, well, I'd go through the whole process again as though I'd never happened, in the hope that the bureaucracy wouldn't pick it up. And I was lucky that time and ended up at Cranwell in number 4 wing.
Whittle didn't enjoy life as an Air Force apprentice. In that rank, he would never get to fly. What brightened Whittle's life was the Model Aircraft Society, where he became the leading light at building working replicas.
So much so that the initials BWMAS, which stood for Boys Wing Model Aircraft Society, was, most people said that meant Boy Whittle's Model Aircraft Society, because we were known as Boy Whittle, Boy Smith and so forth in those days.
Whittle's skills at making model planes singled him out to the authorities. Perhaps he might be officer material.
There were to be 5 cadets selected from number 4 wing at Cranwell, and I was number 6 in the passing out list. So when the number 1 boy failed because of his eyesight, it made me eligible.
The founder of the Royal Air Force had his doubts, though.
Lord Trenchard nearly stopped it, because I hadn't been a leading boy and I hadn't made no kind of a name in sports, on which a lot of weight was put in those days.
Whittle's CO had a compelling reason to make Trenchard think again.
He thought that he'd got a mathematical genius.
It was this natural gift that got Whittle a cadetship. Less than 1% of apprentices made the huge step to join the elite in the Officers' Training College at Cranwell. Although this was next to the apprentices' wing, it was socially another world, one that shared the culture of the public schools from where most of the cadets then came. In the bleak Lincolnshire countryside, Frank Whittle's life now took a new direction. Cranwell provided a very intensive education for Whittle. For the cadets, just as it is today, the highlight of the course was the flying lessons.
I learned to fly on the Avro 504K. That was a very ancient type of aeroplane, 1911 type, and it sort with a toothpick between the wheels, you know, to prevent it tipping over on its nose, which in reality it helps it to tip it over on its nose, or even turn upside down.
Whittle was soon a daring, even overconfident pilot, and one who had his fair share of accidents.
I have to confess that I wrecked 2 or 3 aeroplanes. 3 at least, yes. The first one, I got lost and wanted to get back to Cranwell when the visibility had deteriorated very badly. It was the day, incidentally, of the cross-country run at Cranwell, which all cadets hated. And most of my fellow cadets thought I'd done it to get out of the cross-country run.
In between learning to fly and studying at Cranwell, Whittle first conceived the idea that would make him famous. It all started with a student thesis.
All cadets had to write a thesis, and I chose future developments in aircraft design, rather ambitious, and rather concentrated on the engine side. But the main thing in that thesis was that I arrived at what I now know was the well-known Breguet formula. I wasn't familiar with it at the time, connecting speed, range, engine efficiency, and so forth. And to me, that meant that if you wanted to go very fast and far, you would have to go very high, heights of 50,000 feet, that sort of thing, at heights where the piston engine obviously wouldn't work, and at speeds which where the propeller wouldn't work. So I started to look for a new kind of power plant.
Whittle prepared this paper during the first half of 1928, but his findings at Cranwell were the fruit of the 5 years he had by now been training there.
My Cranwell thesis, when the professor marked it, he wrote on it, in effect, that he didn't really understand it, but he gave me 30 out of 30, which I thought was quite satisfactory.
Whittle envisaged flying speeds of 500 miles an hour, at a time when propeller planes struggled to reach 150. These machines were noisy and shook the pilot terribly. That's because their engines were actually car motors on a bigger scale, with many moving parts. Whittle felt an aesthetic dislike for such power plants.
The problem with the piston engine as you go up height, even though you supercharge it, is that the power drops off as the air gets thinner, and there eventually comes a point where it won't generate enough power to turn itself over against its own friction.
Whittle's idea would use the same principle as a balloon filled with air. When this escapes, every child knows what happens. But it wasn't clear how an engine might recreate such a force.
I considered a piston engine driving a fan inside a hollow fuselage, and then thought, well, why not throw that piston engine away, up the compression ratio of the fan, and substitute a turbine for the piston engine? And there was the turbojet.
By now, Whittle had left Cranwell, but his search for this solution had preoccupied him ever since.
It didn't come to me out of the blue for the simple reason that I've been trying to find it for 18 months. But just the thought, get rid of the piston engine and substitute a turbine, you might say that came out of the blue. Whether I was having a bath or whatever at the time, I couldn't tell you.
Whittle's plan proposed just one moving part. This would be a shaft with a compressor, driven by a turbine at the other end. It would work like this. The compressor spins round, sucking air into combustion chambers at many times atmospheric pressure. Here, this air is mixed with vaporized fuel and ignited. The hot gas created expands through the turbine, turning the shaft, and escapes into the atmosphere. It is this continuous force which propels a jet aeroplane along. The turbojet concept brought with it so many natural advantages.
A very big factor in favour of a jet engine was that when you went up high, the air temperature was very low, very cold, and that benefited the compressor a lot. It meant that you could get much better conditions for the compressor. And the other thing is that in a normal turbine, the velocity coming out of it is wasted. In the case of the jet engine, that was completely used. After the idea had come to me, I thought, oh, my goodness, why didn't I think of this before? And it seemed so obvious then.
This was Whittle's moment of genius. He had seen the future of powered flight, and he was a pilot officer, aged just 22.
I was at the Central Flying School at Wittering doing the flying instructors course. One of the instructors there was W.E.P. Johnson, who became a very good friend and colleague in later years, and he'd been trained as a patent agent. And he became very interested in my proposal. He thought it would work, and he helped me to draft a patent.
Have you ever patented anything?
No, I don't know a thing about it. Does a patent both publish and protect?
That is the whole point of patents. But one thing's essential. File a patent application before touting the thing round, otherwise you haven't a hope. I'll tell you what, let's rough out a specification now.
Fine, what do we do?
Well, you make a rather better sketch and I'll get on with the clever bit, the writing.
Okay.
Armed with his patent, Whittle offered his idea to industry. No one thought it could ever work.
According to the theories of the time, there was this fundamental difficulty with gas turbines, inefficient compressors, inefficient turbines, and the other big snag was the materials then existing in 1929 wouldn't stand temperatures of more than, say, about 500 degrees centigrade. But I knew, or felt pretty confident, that they would evolve in the normal course of development, and of course they did.
The positive young officer also went to London to put his revolutionary concept to the Air Ministry. Whittle fared no better when he met A. Griffith, one of the ministry's top scientists.
I went to see Dr. Griffith and another scientist at South Kensington, explained the idea. It was very coolly received. Griffith pointed out an error in my calculations, and it was all rather depressing, you know. And then after that, I got a letter from the Air Ministry saying, in effect, that they weren't really interested and so forth. It didn't help that I hadn't then received an engineering degree.
Soon after this rejection, Whittle seemed to have more bad news.
After I completed the flying instructor's course, I very nearly got posted to number 4 FTS, Abu Sweir in Egypt. That would have been a real nail in the coffin of the jet engine if that had happened.
Fortunately, the posting was changed. Whittle remained in Britain and served a year as a flying instructor. These were happy times for him. In May 1930, he married Dorothy Lee. During this period, he also got the chance to develop his exceptional flying skills. He was now one of the RAF's best pilots, and was chosen to fly in the Hendon Air Pageants, where he thrilled spectators with his skills at crazy flying. These were the red arrows of the day, and Whittle loved entertaining the public this way. At this time in Germany, a young scientist was eagerly looking forward to his first trip in an aeroplane. His name was Hans von Ohain.
I always dreamed about the beauty of flying. My first flight with a commercial airplane, I believe it was a 3-engine Yonkers, was a great disappointment. It was so noisy and so vibratory that I felt the piston engine and propeller is not the good propulsion system. The elegance of flying is destroyed by it.
The sight of smoke rushing from chimneys inspired von Ohain to think, if that force could be created by a turbine, maybe he could make a smoother aero engine.
High speed was not the primary goal. To me, the smoothness and low noise was more the starting point of my thinking. But as I thought about it, I noticed that, as a matter of fact, it will be capable of driving the airplane faster.
Britain's Air Ministry had declined to keep Whittle's patents a secret. Freely available, they quickly made their way to Germany, just as the Nazis came to power. These patents were widely read in German aviation circles, at the same time that Hitler was rapidly building a new Luftwaffe. Whittle's idea aroused no such interest in Great Britain, and his own jet engine remained stillborn. Yet the Royal Air Force was certainly keen to nurture its inventor.
After 4 years, every general duties officer had to specialise. He was given a choice between engineering, radio, navigation, physical training and so on. But I didn't get a choice because, having been pestering the Air Ministry with inventions, they just said to me, "You will be an engineer." Though they'd stopped sending officers to Cambridge, they decided that I should go. So I went to Cambridge in September 1934 to take the mechanical sciences tripos.
Once at university, Whittle applied every piece of learning to his idea for jet propulsion.
I had got the feeling, rather, that I might be ahead of my time. With the extra knowledge I gained at Cambridge, I did become rather more aware of the difficulties.
Then this letter arrived in the post, which says, "My dear Whittle, this is just a hurried note to tell you that I have just met a man who is a bit of a big noise in an engineering concern, and to whom I mentioned your invention of an aeroplane sans propeller, as it were, and who is very interested." He's jotted a note at the top of the original letter. He says, "This letter changed the course of my life and triggered a revolution in aviation." And it did, because this letter rescued the turbojet idea in this country from oblivion.
The writer was Rolf Dudley Williams, an old friend from Cranwell. He visited Whittle at Cambridge with another former officer named Collingwood Tinling.
And they approached me with the idea of forming a company and getting on with it, and they succeeded.
A merchant bank was the catalyst.
Falcon Partners were approached by an intermediary, an engineer named Bramson. Williams and Tinling got in touch with him, and he got in touch with Falcon Partners, and Falcon Partners commissioned him to write a report on the whole project, which he did, and it was wholly favourable. Bramson's report, you might say, was another of the big key points in the whole story. He'd been very much involved with aviation. He was a pretty skillful aeronautical engineer. And his report inspired Falcon Partners to go on with the job. And in March 1936, they formed the company called Power Jets Limited.
Whittle told his backers the project had a 1 in 30 chance of success. The Air Ministry quickly added another obstacle.
One clause said that I was not to work more than 6 hours a week on the job. But of course, that didn't operate as an effective control on me. I worked practically full-time.
At Cambridge, Whittle also had to fit in the task for which he'd gone to university in the first place.
And I very much wanted first-class honours, so I had to work like hell because I was designing the jet engine and preparing for my finals at the same time. And that was a very difficult thing to do. I succeeded in getting my first, happily, and then was able to turn back to the jet engine.
Whittle approached a manufacturer in Rugby to build the world's first jet engine. British Thomson Houston made steam turbines. Whittle drove over from Cambridge, rehearsing what he'd say to persuade the huge company to accept a contract. He succeeded, when all he could offer them was £2,000, well below what his project really needed.
The proper scientific way to go about the job would be to build a compressor and test it, build a turbine and test it, build combustion chambers and test it, and then put them all together when the results from each were satisfactory. But the cost for that would have been about £30,000, and there was no hope of getting that amount of money. So the only thing to do was go ahead with the complete engine. What we were doing was trying to prove the engine right from the word go.
In a cavernous rugby workshop, Whittle set to work on this huge challenge.
The BTA built the engine, and I stood over it more or less while it was going on. I felt that we were going to be all right as far as the simple centrifugal compressor was concerned. I felt that the turbine was going to be all right, but I was uneasy about the combustion problem because we were aiming at 24 times the kind of combustion intensity that was obtainable in those days. But the engine became ready for running proper on April the 12th of 1937. A lot of people said it wouldn't even turn itself over. What did happen proved the very opposite. I gave a signal with my hands to raise the speed with the electric motor to 2,000 RPM, and that was done. And then I opened the main control, and it started all right. It accelerated out of control, and so did everyone standing around it. They all went down the factory like the wind. I didn't, because I was petrified with fright. I just couldn't move. It seemed like perpetual motion, but of course it wasn't. The fact was that a pool of fuel had accumulated in the combustion chamber, which we didn't know about, and that was keeping it running after I'd switched off the control. Well, that sort of thing happened day after day. We had about 4 of that kind of runaway. Just after the engine first ran and we'd submitted a report to the Air Ministry, this was the subject of another report by Griffith, the man who turned the job down in the early days, and his report damned it with faint praise. He brought in all the difficulties, said that no propeller meant that we wouldn't have the slipstream to help us take off, and so forth.
Whittle didn't know that in Germany some people were by now far more willing to bet on his idea. One of them was Ernst Heinkel, a legend in his country's resurgent aviation industry. Von O'Hine had been introduced to him.
He was alone in his villa in Warnemünde. He explained to me that he wanted to finance the whole thing by himself if it works. And he said, I have the best aerodynamicists, I have the best and best designers, and I want you to tomorrow to speak with them and explain your ideas. I loved the Baltic Sea coast very much. I sure would think that would be a nice place to work, and so I choose Heinkel. Additionally, I felt I was afraid to go to engine companies. I thought they were too much ingrained in their recip engines, and my model didn't work sufficiently good.
Heinkel's company was attractive for another reason.
The whole development was very inexpensive, but when we would have asked for more money, we would have gotten it. So money was not a problem.
By contrast, the Power Jet's kitty was empty. As the Nazi threat grew, Whittle had a war winner, yet Britain was set to abandon it.
There were several things which hampered progress. In 1937-38, the worst was the tight financial situation. Our financial backers began to get cold feet. They had, quite unrealistically, expected that within a matter of a month or two, we would have an engine capable of flying in the stratosphere. Well, of course, we had breakdown after breakdown, and they began to lose heart. And they did not produce the money that they promised. The Air Ministry were very hesitant to help because we were in financial difficulty. After we'd first run the engine and shown that it at least was self-driving, they did agree to a very limited contract.
The ministry's grudging help only created new problems.
As soon as they gave us a contract, we came under the Official Secrets Act. That meant that we couldn't tell people what we wanted their money for. You can't go to someone and say, look, we've got a damn good idea, would you let us have some money? We can't tell you what it is, but it's very good. No, we couldn't do it.
By 1939, Britain had spent just £7,000 on Whittle's jet. His very position on the project was perilous. At the end of June, he was actually due to leave Power Jets. On his last day there, Whittle had to impress an important visitor with his engine.
On June the 30th of 1939, we managed to get a big breakthrough in the attitude of the Air Ministry, in that Pye, Director of Scientific Research, came up to see the engine run, and we managed to keep it going for about 20 minutes in his presence, and he became a complete convert. So much so that he agreed that an engine for flight should be ordered, and that an aeroplane to use it should be ordered too. When I drove him back to the station to get his train back to London, I had the curious experience of him explain to me all the advantages of the engine, that it could run on any fuel, that it was vibrationless, etc., etc. And I just sat quietly. I was only a squadron leader at this time. I thought, yeah, you're telling me, old boy. This, of course, was the big turning point in the whole job.
The turbojet was saved for Great Britain, but Germany, unaware of Whittle's breakthrough, already had a jet plane.
I was very certain that it would work. But, of course, you always feel there's a danger. And we had made not too many pre-tests. We ran the engine before it flew perhaps several hours at the very most.
The support of a huge aircraft company had enabled Hans von Ohain to overtake Whittle. Heinkel's HE-178 was ready just days before war broke out. Test pilot Erich Varsitz was eager to take off.
He started and then he disappeared. And after a while he came back and we thought, oh, he's landing. He didn't. He made another round and we said, oh my God, he must like it. But we didn't have the airplane very filled up with gasoline. He landed and stopped the airplane just where Heinkel stood. And he said everything functioned beautiful and the engine worked well, and he was really himself, very enthused. We had a nice festival.
A jubilant Heinkel rang General Ernst Udet at the German Air Ministry.
I learned later on he called Udet and he said, hey, congratulations, but let me sleep, that's an ungodly time.
By now, Frank Whittle had been forced to move Power Jets from Rugby to a scruffy foundry at nearby Lutterworth. Ladywood Works was the name of the site. Today there's nothing to show that history was once made here. But in these buildings, Britain slowly expanded its jet program.
In 1939 we only had just a handful of about half a dozen. And then at the beginning of 1940 we began to build up a team, and I was very careful in picking real quality. You know, first class honours Cambridge, first class honours Oxford, Imperial College of Science. We were advertising. Of course, we couldn't say what we were advertising for. And when we were interviewing them, we couldn't tell them what we wanted them for, although I think some of them guessed from the questions we asked.
Whittle's charm and enthusiasm at once inspired his new team to strive for the impossible. The noise and lack of space at Ladywood forced Whittle himself to work at Brownsover Hall, a country house nearby. Here he worked through the night, desperately aware that his work could shorten the war, and drove himself to nervous exhaustion.
My memory of him really was just somebody always working. And when he was at home, if he took any time off, say Sunday, he would sit in his chair by the fire at Broomfield, and we'd be there with his slide rule, which of course people used in those days to do their calculations, and bits of paper all over the place, working, and a little bit of time for myself and my brother, but not much, not much.
As Britain entered its most critical phase of the war, the expanding team at Ladywood was galvanised by a new order to prepare engines for a prototype jet fighter. Codenamed F940, we know it as the Gloucester Meteor. As a potential war winner, getting it in the sky to fight the Luftwaffe now became the focus of their work at Power Jets. They did not know that Germany was by now developing its own twin-jet combat planes at Messerschmitt and Heinkel. The country's prototype jet, the HE-178, had not been a success, but its last flight was exploited to the full by its maker.
Heinkel invited the Air Ministry to come, and the highest who came was Udet, and somehow Heinkel used that possibility to offer a new design of a two-engine fighter aircraft. And actually, he got the contract about 2 months later.
The plane was the HE-280. The Nazis wanted it in 14 months. Heinkel passed this demanding deadline to von Ohain to build its jet engines.
Heinkel wanted things very fast. He was very optimistic, very positive, but a little bit unreal and unrealistic in his time schedules.
In Britain, the Air Ministry still wouldn't fund Frank Whittle properly, forcing Power Jets to work in impossible conditions.
In addition to our continuing financial problems, we had many others, like having to use the same parts over and over again when they ought to have been scrapped. And of course that was linked with the finance, because we couldn't afford new parts. We had to make do and furbish up damaged parts.
Some people continued to claim Whittle's jet wouldn't even fly. By May 1941, his engine was ready to go in Britain's first jet plane, the experimental Gloucester E-28-39. For its maiden flight, the top-secret aircraft was taken to Cranwell, where the jet story had begun. The Power Jets team followed, full of hope. On the same day, a young naval pilot, Eric Brown, was forced to land at Cranwell. Today, he's one of the few surviving witnesses of this historic occasion.
When I landed, I was a bit astonished to find so many civilians present. And when I went to check in at the mess and asked what was going on, there seemed to be almost an air of conspiracy about the whole place. And nobody would give a straight answer to this.
We'd been out the day before for some taxiing trials. And then on the May the 15th, the weather looked as though it wasn't going to work out. So I went back to Lutterworth.
That morning I went to the control tower to check if the weather was good enough for my en route flight to Croydon, but it obviously wasn't. And they said, would I mind doing a weather check for them? Anyway, I landed, and they said, would I be prepared to do a further weather test in the afternoon?
And then we got a message to say that the weather was clearing, so I rushed back to Cranwell again. And in the evening, Jerry Sayre did the flight.
An airplane was rolled out with a shape well, not so much the shape, but the construction of which I'd never seen before, because it had no propeller. And an extraordinary whining noise came from it, and it taxied out to the end of the runway, and after a while eventually took off. And I was quite astonished to know what it was, because I'd never heard at this stage in my career of a jet aircraft.
The various government ministries refused to film this remarkable event. Luckily, an unknown photographer grabbed it in secret.
Jerry Sayre was sitting at the end of the runway, and a party of us was sitting just to the right, and he held it on the brakes and ran out the engine to full speed, released his brakes, and then he hopped off in about 600 yards. Quite an impressive takeoff. Then he held it down level and then climbed. One of my colleagues, Pat Johnson, W.E.P. Johnson, slapped me on the back. He said, "Frank, it flies." And in the tension of the moment, I rather rudely said, "That was bloody well what it was designed to do, isn't it?"
And it landed successfully, and immediately it landed, it was absolutely inundated with people rushing out and congratulating the pilot. So I realized something quite extraordinary had taken place.
People in the area hadn't heard that particular kind of noise before, and you couldn't really hide it, however secret it was supposed to be. One officer was said to have asked another one, "How does that thing work, John?" And John replied, "Oh, it's easy, old boy, it just sucks itself along like a hoover." Another story was that someone who claimed to have been an eyewitness said there was a Merlin engine inside the hollow fuselage with a little propeller. And he'd seen it. He was a reliable witness, he claimed.
Well, everybody gravitated towards the officers' mess. And so I followed on, and there was quite a lot of hilarity going on in a corner of the room. I asked what it was all about, but still nobody would reveal what was involved. But it was quite obvious. It was something quite momentous.
The flight vindicated Whittle. Britain's new jet plane was better than anybody had realised. One event particularly brought the point home.
The ministry gave us permission to open up to 17,000 just for one flight. And at that engine speed, it did 375 or 380. Anyway, it was faster than the Spitfire.
The news reached London and Winston Churchill. He ordered 1,000 Whittles. Alas, the E-28 could not be a warplane. Hence the disappointment felt behind the scenes up at Cranwell.
I would have preferred it to have been the Meteor, which was then on the stocks, because that was a combat aeroplane, whereas the E-28 was just an experimental aeroplane.
Whittle's jet served notice on all piston engines, a notice that fast reached their manufacturers. They now demanded their share of a product none had invented, and which they'd rejected for years. Because of the war, Whittle would have to share his secrets with them.
All this, of course, was putting power jets into a weaker and weaker position from the commercial point of view, and that we had to swallow because it was a wartime situation. And I and several other of my team were serving officers, and we had to put national considerations before commercial considerations. That was very dominant in my mind.
Whittle played a selfless, patriotic role, in which he offered his knowledge freely to the British aviation companies. However, they were working flat out to build engines for planes like the Hurricane and the Spitfire. So in 1941, Great Britain turned to the United States, then at peace, for backup in manufacturing its jet engine. The Americans had only been told about Whittle's power plant earlier that year. Ironically, their top scientists had dismissed the concept in 1940. They concluded the gas turbine engine could hardly be considered a feasible application to airplanes. The British government expected to keep the rights in Whittle's invention, and did not intend to give it away to a future competitor. But that's inevitably what happened.
We shipped over the engine in parts in the Bombay Liberator, also with the team, who were horribly frightened lest the pilot should pull the wrong lever and they'd all drop into the Atlantic.
The company selected to build the engine was General Electric.
For America, the jet story began the night of October 4th, 1941, with the arrival of a highly secret engine assembly at a Boston airport. It was Britain's now famous Whittle turbojet, the first jet engine successfully produced and flown by the Allies.
Gentlemen, I give you the Whittle engine. Consult all you wish and arrive at any decision you please, just as long as you accept a contract to build 15 of them.
General Electric had that engine, their engine, version of the W2B, called the Type I, on test in April of 42, so just rather less than 6 months, which is astonishing. And even better than that, 6 months later, the Bell Aircraft Company had their twin-engine jet flying. It was agreed that I would go over and help them out. And so I went over at the end of May. I went to Lynn under an assumed name. They insisted I use an assumed name. I called myself Whiteley. There were times when I forgot it, like in the hotel I would waking up, sign for my early morning coffee, and forget that I was supposed to be using an assumed name, and of course sign the real one. I'm told that that didn't matter really, because the waiter was an FBI man.
In the Great Republic, Whittle was treated royally, and he in turn was astounded by what he found there.
It was most satisfying to see the work GE were doing because, well, they got on with the job so fast. It was remarkable, and their enthusiasm was most inspiring. And I thought at the time, if only I'd had that kind of cooperation a few years earlier, what a difference it would have made.
In America, doctors found that Whittle was by now battling with severe ill health. Back in Britain, the problems that caused it had only got worse.
The engine that was destined to be the power plant of the Meteor was a more powerful version of the experimental engine, really. There was no major difference. It looked quite similar from the outside.
The Royal Air Force eagerly awaited the Meteor, but Powerjets was not allowed to produce the engines for it. That job had been contracted to a car maker, Rover.
Blunders were getting on with the job fairly well, but Rovers were making an absolute nonsense of the engine. They just hadn't got the people who could do the job, and they thought they knew what to do. The situation became so bad that it looks as though there would be a complete hash of everything. The Rover were making such a poor job of the engine that the order for the production of the Meteor was cut right back.
Rover tried to redesign its engines and held up the Meteor by 2 years, but there was also dirty work.
We intended that the Rover company should be subcontractors and only subcontractors, but unfortunately they went behind our back to the ministry and trying to get direct contracts, and eventually they succeeded in doing that. And instead of being subcontractors to us, they in effect became competitors who had the advantage of having all our information handed to them on the orders of the ministry.
In December 1942, a solution was at last found to the problems with Rover. Rolls-Royce took over the job of building Whittle's engines. But the mighty company would only weaken Powerjets further.
Ernest Hayes was the chief executive of Rolls-Royce. He was responsible for the Rolls-Royce part in taking over the jet development. Of course, he had come to realize that this was the future of the aero engine. And since Rolls-Royce then were one of the most prominent aero engine firms in the world, he wasn't going to be left out. I would call him an honest rogue, because when he was going to do the dirt, he told you he was in advance. And one of the things he said to me on one occasion was, he said, "We're going to be the centre of this job, and nothing you can do will stop us." By 1943, the Rolls-Royce having made such a big difference to the prospects of the engine, the ministry agreed to reinstate the production of the Meteor.
With Whittle's engines, the plane finally made its first flight that year. Yet it should have been ready 2 years earlier. And had the Air Ministry pursued Whittle's idea back in 1929, a similar plane would have been available by the start of the war to repel the Luftwaffe. Lives would have been saved. The war even shortened. At least the work of Frank Whittle could now have a bearing on how that war was fought.
I thought that he was doing something quite important, because every time I asked my mother what he was doing, she used to say, "Oh, well, Daddy's doing something very hush-hush." I didn't become aware that he was anybody out of the ordinary until 1944 in January, when they made the whole thing public. And then the house became surrounded by reporters.
We had been working in complete secrecy until early January 1944, at which time, for reasons I don't really know, the British and American governments decided to make an announcement about it. And it was like the world blew up around me. The shock was very considerable.
Whittle and his engine dominated the front pages.
Says here in the Daily Herald, "I knew Frank had a secret," says his wife. So the cat is out of the bag. How strange it seems to be able to talk about it. It may mean that I shall be known throughout the world. In any case, my younger son Ian is a far brighter boy than I was at his age. I think he will be a success, the success of the family.
Had you seen that before?
No, I've never seen that before. Oh dear, how wrong.
As industry reaped the rewards of Whittle's genius, new jet fighters joined the Meteor. First off the drawing board was de Havilland's brilliant Vampire. The pilots loved their new equipment, although the planes remained highly secret, as Eric Brown discovered when he came to fly them.
When I was allotted to the jet flight at Farnborough, of course it was a top secret flight, and it was in a hangar at the far side of the airfield, well away from the main activity, and there were RAF regiment guards there with guard dogs, so it was very highly guarded at the time.
Once inside, the plane was a revelation to Brown.
We're getting into the cockpit of a jet airplane for the first time. You are struck by the wonderful view, because in a tricycle undercarriage, no propeller or large engine ahead of you, it is quite remarkable. And once you start up the engine, although to listen to a jet, if you're outside the cockpit, it sounds thunderous, when you're in the cockpit, it is incredibly quiet.
Frank Whittle often visited Farnborough to check how his invention was performing.
It was quite obvious he was itching to get his hands on it and fly it. But we were always alerted that he was coming, and a little memo would be passed round saying, would you make sure that the 2839 was not serviceable for flight on that particular day? And because this would stave off Frank, it was obvious they didn't want this wonderful airplane and this wonderful man to be united in case there was an accident. So he twigged this pretty soon, and I think he played along with it.
In July 1944, the Gloucester Meteor became the first jet fighter to enter operational service, when the Air Force allocated its initial supply of planes to 616 Squadron at Manston in Kent. By now, the Luftwaffe could no longer mount air raids over Britain, but these Meteors were quickly put to work, intercepting a lethal new menace, the V-1 guided missile. Germany's flying bomb terrified the Londoners who were its target. In the skies over Kent, the Meteor pilots sought to prevent V-1s reaching the capital. Some used their wingtips to flip the missile over, so it crashed. Around this time, Allied pilots were startled to find themselves being attacked by a German plane with no propeller. This was the Messerschmitt 262. Germany's own jet program had by now advanced to this sophisticated design. It had been chosen instead of the HE-280. The Nazis never liked Heinkel and had cancelled his promising jet fighter. Yet it could have been mass-produced by 1944. By contrast, the 262 arrived late and was rushed into battle too soon. In Britain, meanwhile, Frank Whittle seemed at his peak. He was a national hero, while his company now had a custom-built factory from which to expand. He had a clear vision for its future.
I always wanted to include manufacturing in our duties. In 1944, power jets had reached the point where they were able to produce, say, batches of 40 or 50 engines. And we had a first-class nucleus for proper manufacturing organisation.
Power jets also had some outstanding work in progress. Whittle was already planning the second generation of jet engines.
There was the LR1 turbofan, which would have been the first turbofan in the world. There was the engine for the Miles M52, the supersonic aeroplane. Those were our two big projects which we had in hand.
LR1 stood for Long Range 1. Whittle saw the scope for jets that would fly planes further as well as faster than pistons. But he would need a more efficient engine.
From the earliest days of the turbojet engine, I was bothered by the fact that it has a basically low propulsive efficiency, about 50% as compared with, say, a propeller at moderate speeds of 80%. And so the answer to me was that we must gear down the jet in some way. And that led to the concept of the turbofan, for which I took out a patent in 1936.
The turbofan is a turbojet to which a fan has been added. This fan causes air both to flow through the core of the engine and to bypass it. This additional jet of cold air increases thrust and improves fuel economy. The design had huge potential.
With a turbofan, you can expect propulsive efficiencies of 75% or even better if you have a very large bypass ratio.
As piston engine bombers approached their design limits with planes like the Lancaster, Whittle saw a timely use for his new bypass jet.
As the war progressed, in 1943 for example, I came to the conclusion that it could be the answer to a long-range bomber for the Pacific War. We also visualised it as an engine for a transatlantic aeroplane.
Whittle was already predicting long-range jet airliners and the kind of engines they would need. But it was the other power jet project that would grab people's attention.
The engine for the supersonic plane, the M52, was an aft fan with afterburning and all tacked onto the back end of a W2700 jet engine, and that should have given sufficient power for the Miles M52 to do 1,000 miles an hour. I think it would have done it.
Despite its huge potential, Whitehall never felt comfortable with power jets. It was a private company, but its driving force was a serving officer, and it was publicly funded. The fault lines were clear.
I realised that there was a complete mess from the contractual point of view. There were no effective agreements, and no one except power jets had risked any money, except the government, of course. And I felt that the government having put in $2 million, that all the companies should be nationalised, forming a collective turbojet establishment, and of course I hoped that power jets would be at the top of the pyramid, with myself as chief engineer.
Whittle's proposal was considered in the high levels of government.
Sir Stafford Cripps, the Minister of Aircraft Production at that time, used what I'd said to get the ministry out of the mess that they created by nationalising power jets only, which relieved them of all their undertakings.
It was expected that power jets would still continue with its advanced engine projects.
But then other firms began to create difficulties. They said they weren't going to have the government competing with private enterprise. So considerable pressure was brought to bear on the ministry.
And the minister caved in to the large aero-engine companies.
So we, the people who had pioneered the whole thing, were deprived of the right to design and build engines. Sorry. That was too much for myself and my leading team members, and most of us resigned.
The supersonic plane and the turbofan project had by then been cancelled. The civil servants found a reason to justify this loss.
Believe it or not, the minister said that people wouldn't want to fly at speeds more than about 250 miles an hour.
As Whittle left power jets, he was acutely aware of the commercial opportunity that was now at stake.
The position in 1945 and 1950 was that Britain was really ahead of the world in all forms of gas turbine development, but stupidly we allowed the lead to slip away.
In 1945, the Allies discovered the Germans' impressive range of jet planes and their designers.
After the capitulation of Germany, I was at that time in Farnborough the CEO of the captured enemy aircraft flight. So I was sent to Germany and to look at their advanced aircraft, and also at the same time to interrogate their designers and test pilots. Amongst them was von Ohain, and naturally I wanted to know what his connection with the Whittle patent had been in Germany. But he was not going to answer this question. He was very non-committal and sidestepped it as much as he could.
Brown flew the various German jet planes, including the Messerschmitt 262. The Allies already knew that its engine, the Umo 004, was a sophisticated axial flow design. Now they could compare its performance with that of the less complex British jets.
So a more efficient engine in many ways. It was highly unreliable. The UMO 004 in operational service had a scrap life of only 25 hours. And the engine, when I flew this engine, I found it extremely sensitive and difficult to handle because it did not like quick throttle movements, either accelerating or decelerating. Any quick throttle movement, either way, could possibly cause a flame out of the engine.
Whittle's jets were more reliable, but he could take them no further. The course of events brought anguish.
I think my mother was most distressed by what was happening to father. She was most distressed. I could remember her crying about it at times because she would tell me, "Oh, Daddy's so unwell because of what's happening, and it is such a shame, and how can they treat him like this?" Yes, it's very sad for her. He managed to soldier on in the RAF. He was an Air Commodore in 1946, but in the end, by 1948, he'd been declared as unfit for flying, and somehow that was the last straw, and he and the RAF both agreed that he should retire, and he did.
It's been very sad for him.
Oh, very sad, yes. The Air Force was everything to him.
The public knew none of this and saw a war hero receiving his just rewards. In 1948, Whittle went to Buckingham Palace to collect a knighthood. He also had a financial award for his invention, which was good for the time. Worth nearly £3 million today, it would soon become clear he was greatly under-rewarded. He sought a role, but his stature made him hard to place in an industry he himself had founded. No engine maker hired his services.
In many ways, I paid quite heavily for the work I did. There was the awful race against time. That dominated life. On top of all the technical difficulties, there were the financial difficulties, there was the skullduggery of people who were messing things up, and it was frustration after frustration, and it took its toll. I began to have a series of nervous breakdowns, and for years, it was years before I really recovered my health.
Britain stole a march on the rest of the world when it launched the first jet airliner. The beautiful new plane, with its 4 engines, was a fruition of all Frank Whittle's early visions.
First, after he left the RAF, he turned his mind to the introduction of the Comet, and he joined BOAC as a consultant to help them introduce the Comet into service. He was very worried at the time that the thing was being rushed into service. I've got his 1949 diary where he discusses the strength of the square windows, and he was worried about that at the time, and was making a suggestion to de Havilland's on how they could get over the problem.
Whittle's advice was ignored. The Comet crashes which followed were caused in part by its square windows. With time on his hands, Whittle travelled and tried to recover his health. He also turned to writing his memoirs. The jet age took off without Frank Whittle, but the Royal Air Force was soon re-equipped with the benefits of his invention. By 1950, the Gloucester Meteor provided the backbone of Britain's air defence capability. It was a fitting outcome to all the secret toil of the Power Jets team in the dark days of the war. The nation did at last build its own supersonic fighter, in the shape of the English Electric Lightning, while jet engines also powered an awesome British fleet of nuclear bombers. But the country could never really afford such planes. They would later play an important role in the Falklands campaign, but were destined to become museum pieces. British civil jet planes fared little better. After the Comet crashes, it was Boeing 707 which brought long-range jet travel to the masses. By 1960, airlines were mostly buying their planes from America. That year, the bypass engine entered service. Turbofans soon followed. With their far better fuel economy, they were just what the airlines needed to realise low-cost global travel. For Frank Whittle, it was the ultimate vindication of his wartime vision, and revealed the sheer folly of cancelling his pioneer turbofan. Yet he never worked on jet engines again, and memories began to fade of how the story had begun.
I think in this country they were beginning to forget all about Frank Whittle by the 60s and 70s.
It was all so different in the United States.
They were so much more gung-ho. They were very good at slapping him on the back and telling him what a good chap he was.
In 1976, Whittle went to live in America.
I think he felt more recognised over in the States than he did over here.
After the war, Hans von Ohain had himself moved to America to work on jet propulsion for the US Air Force. Fascinated by each other's work, Whittle and von Ohain became good friends. Back across the Atlantic, Britain eventually rediscovered its genius of the jet.
By 1986, even the Queen took a hand and awarded him the Order of Merit. And other honours came along following that. So I would say from about the early 80s onwards, people began to remember who it was who was the prime pioneer of the turbojet.
And also a man with a profound legacy. Today, we make almost 1.5 billion air passenger journeys a year, cheaply and safely, thanks to Frank Whittle. He shrank the world, but his gift to Britain is less appreciated. Its famous plane makers have departed, but today, Rolls-Royce is a world leader in building jet engines.
I'm often asked how I feel about it, and it's a question I find very difficult to answer. Things could have been a lot better. We could have had a much bigger influence in the war than happened. But when I see what's happened in the way of civil aviation and military aviation too, but particularly civil aviation, I can only say it's extremely satisfying, especially when you see something like the Concorde. And one of the things, you see, I never foresaw when I was working on this thing, is that I would be a passenger crossing the Atlantic in 3.5 hours. And incidentally, another thing I didn't foresee is that I would have a son who would be flying 747s as a captain in Cathay Pacific.
Kai Tak Aerodrome at Hong Kong had a very interesting approach, a curved right-hand turn right down to almost a touchdown. And when Father came with me in the back of in the cockpit in a Boeing 747, he was very startled when he saw that his son was flying an airplane at 1,000 feet straight towards the foothills and then making a steep final turn, which of course was quite normal at Kai Tak. It was the way you had to do it. I hadn't briefed him, unfortunately, so he was very white-knuckled by the time we landed. He was continuing to theorize in aerodynamic improvements and aero-engine improvements until the end of his life. He always took an active interest in Concorde and looking into a second-generation SST, supersonic transport, and making recommendations and speaking publicly and privately amongst the industry to try and encourage the airframe manufacturers to take the risk and embark on another generation of supersonic transports.
Concorde is a marvellous aeroplane. I've flown it many times, but I'm looking forward to the next generation of supersonic transports, which I think should be capable of carrying 300 passengers for distances of the order of 4,500 miles, like San Francisco, Tokyo, at speeds of about a Mach number of about 2.3. That's getting up to 2,000 miles an hour, as compared with the Concorde's 1350. But beyond that, I think we're going to see even much higher speeds than that in due course. Unfortunately, they're going to be very expensive propositions.
Sir Frank Whittle died in August 1996, assured of his position as the greatest aero engineer of the 20th century. The Royal Air Force paid fitting tribute to its distinguished son with a memorial service at Westminster Abbey.
He and I had wanted the opportunity to fly together, preferably in an open cockpit biplane, so that together we could loop and spin and climb and dive. This modest ambition was never realized for one reason or another. The nearest we got was when I flew him to Hong Kong in a Boeing 747. On the last morning of his life, I leant over his bed and said, "Dad, let's put on our kit and go flying." He opened his eyes and looked at me and smiled. That evening, with Hazel holding his hand, he died. And I wondered if he went flying, and if he did, if he went on his own, or did he have a companion? He was cremated in the USA, and the air attaché there brought his ashes over to this country, and I went to Heathrow to meet the aeroplane, and I came home and put the ashes on the bookshelf in my study with the ashes of my mother, who died 3 weeks earlier. I decided to put them in at the Church of Cranwell, and they organised a meteor and a vampire. So we flew the ashes up to Cranwell, and they were interred there with a little ceremony.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
The only reason for an airplane to exist is to go fast. At the Great Air Meet in Rheims, Glenn Curtis set a world's record of just over 43 miles an hour, and the quest for speed was on. In 1913, Maurice Prévost was flying a streamlined Dépôt-Dessin monoplane at 126 miles an hour, and Europe claimed the lead in aviation speed. Immediately after World War I, quest for speed became a catalyst for the development of fighter planes. Countries which had not invested in new engines for their wartime fighters would, for reasons of national pride, invest in new engines to race them peacetime. Then, in America in the 1930s, the situation reversed itself. Civilian aircraft, like the Travel Air Mystery Ship and the GB, Waddell Williams racers, became even faster than military aircraft. The reason was simple. Same engines were available to both civil racers and military fighters. The fighters had to carry guns, bombs, oxygen, and radios, while the racers were built only for speed. The world's absolute speed record was passed from country to country. And as the racers became faster and more powerful, they also became more expensive. America's Howard Hughes could afford to build his own racer, and with it set a land-plane speed record. But the absolute speed record of 440 miles an hour was set by a Macchi MC-72 seaplane in 1934, financed by the Italian government. Then military aircraft came back into the lead as the Heinkel and Messerschmitt firms competed for the title. Messerschmitt Bf-109R set a speed record of 469 miles an hour in 1939, a record that lasted for many years. When the jet aircraft came out, speed records rapidly accelerated, the British breaking 1,000 miles an hour in 1956 in a Fairey Delta II. Speeds continued to climb, finally reaching 2,193 miles an hour in 1976 by the Lockheed SR-71, alias Blackbird. While speed was the object, there were many other benefits in creating ever faster aircraft. Improvement in fuels, streamlining, lubricants, materials, and the list goes on. Speed produced not only prestige and pleasure, but also utility. The speed record setters ultimately paved the way for commercial transports, business jets, and private planes.